sports are really important vehicles for relationships.
We have purpose. We have a why. We bring people together. We connect.
I feel like God is our greatest supporter and our greatest coach.
Welcome to Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Rabbi Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. This week we're joined by a legend in the journalism field of sports. But beyond sports, he really speaks about how sports intersect with a larger section of all of society, whether it's culture, religion, or arts, or any story that often we don't hear about, but is really the breaking news of the day. Kurt Streeter, originally of ESPN, the magazine, the Los Angeles Times, New York Times Sports of the Times column, and if you didn't know, captain of the UC Berkeley tennis team. Kurt, it's great to have you on Rabbi on the Sidelines. How you doing?
Thank you, Rabbi. I appreciate it. Thanks for the nice introduction.
Of course. Let's start with the UC Berkeley tennis team. What was your journey to tennis in a world that, and it's Wimbledon right now. So why the love of tennis, and maybe how can the U.S. show tennis a little more love today than it really gets?
Yeah, it could. Well, first of all, if it produces about 4 Roger Federers, then I think maybe things will change. But we'll see. We'll see. My journey in tennis is sort of a long one that really starts with my father, who was an athlete in the 1950s. Actually, starting in the late 40s, early 50s at the University of Oregon. So my dad was one of the first black basketball players to play at the University of Oregon. And so go Ducks. And he taught himself how to play tennis while he was on campus. And then he played some AAU ball, which at the time was kind of like developmental league, let's say, in the modern parlance, in basketball for a couple of years, continued on in his tennis journey, became a complete tennis junkie, and then taught myself and my brothers the game. But a pivotal moment for me was when Arthur Ashe won Wimbledon in 1975, and I watched that match with my dad. And I just, the second I had always known and watched Arthur play, and he was kind of a hero in our household. And when he won, and first of all, when he stepped out on that court at Wimbledon, and with the whole look, the afro, and he just looked so cool and so suave. And I just decided that I wanted to do that. I wanted to try to become a great tennis player. My goal was to become a professional. I was a professional, but eventually, played after my time at Cal. But basically low level pro. I didn't quite make it to the level that I originally wanted, but I was very happy with my overall career. And playing at Cal
so much
really
so that you, in fact, named your son Ashe, I believe.
Exactly. Yeah. So my young 12-year-old son is named Ashe, ASHE. As it happened, throughout my junior career, I was one of the better players in the Pacific Northwest, where I grew up, for most of my time as a junior, starting when I was about 12. And then I was a nationally ranked junior for several years as well, 16, 17, 18 years old. Arthur Ashe had a habit of helping almost all of the top young black players that he could. Mm-hmm. They're not too many of us, really. But he reached out. I met Arthur. He reached down and ended up helping me to attend the Nick Bollettieri Tennis Academy, which is the academy in Florida where a lot of the great stars came from in the 80s, and it's still going. It's the IMG Academy now. So he helped to fund my time at Bollettieri's, which was about half of my senior year of high school.
Oh wow!
So there's a great story of me when I'm about 16 years old, and I get a phone call in the evening as I'm studying, and it happened to be Arthur calling me directly to just tell me that he was doing all he could to try to get me to Bollettieri's. So,
well,
pretty neat. Yeah.
One of the great phone calls that I got was from Kurt Streeter, and that was a couple of months ago, because I read your column in the New York Times. Before I read it, I got sent that column from many of my members who knew my passion about sports, but also about faith. And that article was about it's about during the Damar Hamlin times, but it was called "In Troubled Time: The Sports World Offers a Necessary Salve," and it was about this intersection of religion and sports. And I reached out to a good friend of this program, Gary Belsky. I said, "This guy worked for ESPN the magazine. I bet you know him." And within minutes, I was connected with you, and you took time to actually share your own story as well. So we're gonna just go through a few of your articles that I got to read over the many, many articles that you've gone through different publications, and talk about how you come up not simply with topics, but trying to tell a bigger story to an audience that is not just looking for what actually happened on the court that night. And so let's talk about that story. Damar Hamlin happened. You're looking at sort of January through March, and there's different aspects of faith happening in the sports world. How do you bring that to our attention through this article?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm always I'm always intrigued by the human condition, and when people are at their lowest moment, and I call them strugglers and stragglers. I'm always I just zone in on that, and to see a young man nearly die right before us that evening with Damar, it was very, very tough for the entire nation really to witness. So I just need I knew I had to weigh in. I was asked to weigh in by the paper, and I just tried to bring a different perspective outside of well, gosh, when is he going to come back? I just cared about him, and then also how we view sports and how we should think about it when in football, a sport that it can literally be life or death, and or people being maimed, or CTE and brain trauma and all those things that I think many of the players that we see today. Granted, there's been great progress made on the concussion front. I think it's almost certain that many of the players in their future lives will be struggling with traumatic brain injuries that they're dealing with now. So I just knew I wanted to get in there, and that kind of thing is just right up my alley. Then I went to Buffalo for the first Bills game after he was injured, and wrote about that. I just tried to stay on point with everything that was going on. That was kind of amazing to think about. Really, the entire nation was really kind of transfixed on this one player and his circumstance, and then he makes this miraculous recovery, like literally almost a miracle. And now he's playing again,
ready to go.
Who would have thought that? Who would have thought that?
So when you say get in there, right? When you did your piece on Jameis Winston, you said that you spent 2 months with him.
Yeah.
And when you did these pieces on Maya Moore, and in her own book with Jonathan Irons, they speaks about the trust that you have, or the trust that they have in you. How do you build that trust? And there's also a different thing that you write, or you've actually said in some interviews, that you bring out empathy in the stories, even when sometimes you're not as complimentary to the athletes as they would like. So how do you build that trust while having them understand that not everything's going to be, the perfect picture, that there will be some ups and downs as well?
Yeah. Well, I guess the issue for a story like the Maya Moore story, or many of the stories that I've written where I really take a lot of time, that's a bit different than writing a column, which I've been writing regularly. As probably many of the people listening to this and watching this know, there's some pretty big shifts at the New York Times. So I'm going to be moving on to other things soon, and we can talk about that if you want. But I just try to, I guess I'm just one who really cares about people. I try to as much as possible, and that's why I got into journalism, like to really try to understand people, and to try to connect with them. I've always considered myself an outsider in life. I'm biracial. I come from a family where my parents, my black father and my white mother, were married in 1954. So you can imagine that the road was not exactly easy for the Streeter family coming up in America. Myself and my 3 brothers and my mom and dad. So I've always sort of watched things happen to other people and wanted to connect with them and wanted to understand why there were people in our neighborhood that did not speak to us, for instance, when I was growing up. I just took that sort of attitude. I'm just really curious. And I think when you show people you are genuinely curious about their life, that allows a connection to build. And with my, so there, it's almost indescribable how it's just a feeling, I think, that you can bring to people that you really care about them. I really cared about Maya, and I really wanted to know. I wasn't there to, write some big expose about her. I wanted to know why she was retiring and trying to help this, one of the greatest women's basketball players, one of the greatest basketball players, period, retires in her prime to help an inmate get out of prison because she felt that he was wrongly convicted. And there was more to the story, of course. But I think,
and now married with their child, which is amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that they could see, hopefully they could see my care and that I was really diligent about telling their story and doing it right. I think with people like Jameis, I was with Jameis Winston for several months in the run up to the NFL draft. At the time, I mean, he's always been somewhat of a controversial figure. I because of some of the things that had happened with him regarding women while he was in college, and people can research that. I didn't shy away from writing about that. He knew that. I still cared and tried to understand his story as best I could. And I think he just really appreciated that. In my background too, I'm lucky enough to come from a middle-class family. My dad was very successful in business as an architect. He was an architect here in Seattle, where I live now. But I do have family members that really, really struggled. I have family members that were in prison. I have family members that have struggled with addiction. I have family members who died of addiction. I feel at a very visceral level that, a connection with people that are on the outside of society, pariahs. When I was a kid, I would go, I have spent Thanksgivings visiting family members in prison when I was a teenager. So that gives me, I think, and yet I love these people, and I love my cousin who died of addiction on Skid Row. I think that allows me to wade into territory with people who many people in society would want to banish and completely let go of and pretend that they don't exist.
So one question is about the Maya Moore story about faith, and the other question is about your journey to sports journalism in specific, because you didn't start there. It's not like, oh my gosh, I want to be the next Dick Vitale, I want to be the next Al Michaels. Actually, you started journalism covering crime in Los Angeles, covering religion. And so, and in those crime aspects, I read an article that you talked about how you, after, I believe it was in a capital punishment case, that you went to go meet the victims of the families, or the families of the victims. Any crossover between those? What do you bring in terms of journalism to both of those aspects that also are brought to the general reading public that, as you said, can bring empathy and learn more about people?
Well, yeah, first of all, I did not start out trying to be a sports reporter. I actually spent much of my early career really trying to not go over to sports, because I felt like I felt like people were expecting that I would be would only want to do sports. I'm a black guy who's, big and athletic and played sports. It's the natural that people would think that I would want to do that when I got into journalism. So much of my life has been about doing things the opposite of what people expect. So I wanted to prove that I could cover City Hall. I could write about the LAPD. I could cover transportation. I could cover religion. And within my time particularly at the LA Times, also the Baltimore Sun, I spent a lot of time in really distressed neighborhoods and with people that are really struggling in projects and in poverty and all of the things that then kind of follow with that. And then when I started to move over to sports, I just tried to take the same. Again, it's all about curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to take the same kind of curiosity that I had for that. For reporting on those sorts of populations into my sports work in whatever I do. And I don't really, when I write about sports, I'm not really thinking about the games or the transactions or who's gonna, that stuff doesn't really interest me. What interests me is more, again, the human condition. Especially people who are on the outside. I'm always much more interested in the losers than I am the winners. So I'd rather hang out with the 12th person on the bench than LeBron James. I've done some reporting with stars and all of that, but I am not. That doesn't really excite me.
Well, one of the things you talk about in the human condition is actually Rufus the hawk, not even a human being. That you write an entire story about how without this hawk there would be no Wimbledon. How do you come up with a story like that?
I gotta say, first of all, hats off for the research. That's fantastic.
My favorite part of the job, it mostly ends up in sermons. So
yeah, it's just great. Sometimes the nice thing about sports is that there's all these tough things that I try to write, that I can write about. And now as a columnist over the last several years, I've tried to really wade in on some really tough social issues and I'll be really kind of hammering people on about something really serious, misogyny or race or what have you. But then sometimes, I just need I need a break from that. I think the readers don't want to continue to always hear that from me. So a story like, Rufus the Hawk is just the perfect tonic. And, that one, I was at Wimbledon, and for those who don't know, I think it's been a little while since I wrote that piece, but Wimbledon has a problem with pigeons would come down onto the court sometimes while play is going on. All these pigeons, coming down onto the grass or, letting go from above while the players are playing. So they have hawks, and they particularly have Rufus the hawk there at Wimbledon to scare away all the other birds. And they bring in Rufus in the mornings. And so when I found out about Rufus, I naturally just really wanted to, gosh, what a wonderful, cool story. I wanted to meet Rufus and then meet his keepers. And they had a whole great story about, their love of birds and all of these things I had no idea about any of this. Again, it's curiosities. So much of my job, honestly, I feel like, really, they pay me to what? They pay me to go do this? Like I get to go, and I hung out with Rufus, and Rufus came down and swooped onto my arm on center court at Wimbledon when nobody was there. He was doing his thing. They let him loose to fly around, and then he comes back. He's a trained hawk, so they let me do that just to see what it was like. Really, that's not work. So that was an example of a story that's just one heck of a lot of fun. And I just like to, mix it up like that. But again, there were two things: curiosity and my, really wanting to know his keepers, who were just like great personalities. There was a father and daughter. They just had great personalities, and it was just cool. So that whole aspect of my job, the things that I've been able to see, and I'm not a foreign correspondent that's done war coverage or anything, but my God, I've seen, hang out with Rufus the Hawk at Center Court Wimbledon. I've witnessed a execution at San Quentin. I've been with, Rodney King shortly before he died. I don't say that, like the execution thing with a big, I guess I'm excited about the fact that I was there and I was trusted as a witness for the people, for my readers to see what happens. The state of California is putting somebody to death for their crimes. Somebody needs to be there as a witness. And I feel incredibly lucky and privileged the fact that I was actually a conduit to that story.
Mm.
And again, it's like it's not a job in a way, it's a calling in a way. And it's I feel so lucky. I feel so lucky. And even the terrible things that I've witnessed. That execution was in 2001, I want to say. I still have nightmares about it.
Wow.
Still have nightmares about that execution. Yeah, all these years later. And I spoke to the guy that was David Lee Massey, who was executed. Spoke to him on the phone a few days before he was put to death. And I also wrote about the victims. And I spent a lot of time with the victims, or the families of the victims. These were two murder cases.
It's interesting that you're bringing these cases and stories up years later, right? In the moment, they're quote unquote breaking news. But there's a great book by Jen Maxfield. She's with the NBC New York, and she wrote, I forgot the title of the book most recently, but she revisits the story 20 years later, what was breaking news then, and sees those stories, what's happening to those people now. Are there any times when you go back to either those people or those stories and seeing what happened to see maybe you made their lives or their neighborhoods or our communities just a little better by what you did, as you said, to witness that human element and curiosity at those times?
Well, something that I'm doing actually right now, and I hope to, we'll see exactly where it publishes with everything that's going on at the New York Times right now. I will have a job, and I believe I'm going to land very well. But for the LA Times in 2005, I followed a young girl boxer in East LA, and who was a champion boxer at about 12, 13 years old. I followed her and her family for about 2 years. The LA Times wrote a 5-part series entitled "The Girl" about this young boxer, Sinisa Estrada. The story was the story won a bunch of awards. The paper put it up for a Pulitzer. Maybe one of the longest stories that the LA Times has ever published. And the story was it was a boxing story, but it really wasn't a boxing story. It was a redemption story. It was a story about a father and a daughter, and because Sinisa's father, Joe, was a 2-time felon, and California has a 3 strikes law. So, I'm not sure at the time, if he committed another felony, he was going to be put in prison for life. He's an ex-junkie, ex-heroin junkie, ex-gang member in East LA, hardcore guy in his past, who was really doing his best and really was turning the corner in his life. So I was just immediately drawn to that story, and how the sort of the symbiosis between those two, Sinisa sort of fighting, understanding that her fighting was helping her father, and Joe, her manager, who was her coach, basically, really pouring his whole love and life into his daughter as a way to redeem himself. So I really saw that as a redemption story. It turns out that, and I saw it the second I saw this kid at the time, boxing, I could tell that because I've been around some pretty great athletes, I could tell, wow, okay, this kid has got it. I said to myself, if she was, in another environment playing tennis, she would be a tennis champion. If she was playing soccer, she could just see she had physical genius. Well, it turns out all these years later, to make a long story short, she's now WBA and WBC world champion.
Wow.
31 years old now, and fighting in women's boxing, which is starting to take a bit of hold. And she's leading cards so she's the main attraction on several fights, and she's fighting for hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is a young kid who, when she was young, her family was definitely enmeshed in poverty, and so I'm gonna go back and revisit that story all these years later. I'm super.
Where's her dad now?
And her dad has done great.
Wow.
Great. It's an interesting thing, and when you do these sorts of stories, especially the really long ones, you really develop a bond with your story subjects. And I don't think I've ever. There's several other situations like this. I mean, you just feel like they're part of your family in a way. It's sort of like you're telling the story together. And I wrote about Joe, particularly warts and all. I mean, it was all out there, all the stuff he had done. He knew I was going to write about that. I mean, I went into detail of about his past. But it's weird. It's sort of like he's sort of like I feel like he's like my brother in a way. Like we don't talk that much, but whenever it's that sort of thing, when we do talk, it's like immediately, Joe, and we come from completely different backgrounds. But we love each other, I think, because I know so much about him. And the same thing with Sinisa. I feel like I care for her like she's my niece.
Wow.
Like she's my young niece. And so it'll be a little different. This is going to be the series was very personal. I was in it. There were times, like, for instance, Joe and I got attacked by a gang member at one point when we were at the gym in East LA at Hollenbeck Gym. And I wrote about my, me ducking, the guy was throwing chairs and at Joe, and I wasn't sure if there was going to be some guns or I was pretty scared. So I was in that, and I hope to also write this follow up from my perspective, and also some of my concerns about boxing now, because in 2005 I didn't know as much as I know now about CTE and brain trauma, and now I look at boxing a lot differently than I used to.
It's interesting that you say redemption stories, because that's what, as a rabbi, we're always looking to tell. And there's so many of those stories that are just simply not told. And actually, as we gear up towards our High Holy Days in just a matter of a couple of months, we often feature those stories of amazing. I would love to interact with Joe and Sinisa and leading up to Yom Kippur, God willing. But let's go to Maya Moore, because that's another redemption story in a different way, that she was the redeemer and not the redemptee, and faith. Because in the book that I read about her and Jonathan Irons, so much of her upbringing was like Bible-based, and so much of her life is Bible-based. How much of that do you believe played a role in what she was going to be doing, let's say, in quotation, God's plan? And sometimes God's plan works, and sometimes God's plan doesn't work. So how much of faith was based in that story, and how much did you focus on that based on your previous role as religion journalist?
Faith was absolutely huge in that story. I just think it's a motivating factor for basically everything that Maya Moore does. And she grew up in that kind of household with her mom, and her mom and the family that surrounded them as Maya was a kid. Very, very Christian. I don't know if they would call. I'm not sure if they would call themselves evangelical.
It was in the book, they used that word, so yeah, definitely.
So really that is their guide, absolutely. And I think it just motivates them to just live their life on a daily basis. So when Maya's family met Jonathan Irons in what was basically a prison ministry. It was her, as I recall. Maybe it's been a while. It was her great uncle and other family members who were going into the prison to teach music and to meet with prisoners. Of course, there was a religious Christian element to that. They met Jonathan. They heard his story. They became very close to him. They started to look into his claims of innocence, in a very serious way, almost like private investigators themselves. And they started to really believe there was something wrong here with the case. And Maya initially, pardon me if I mess any of this up again, it's been a while since I thought about the story, but she initially met Jonathan when she went in with the ministry. I think she was right before she went off to UConn, and they were friends for years, where they stayed in contact. And so even literally the apparatus for them meeting was religion. And so that's very Maya Moore. That's very much her family.
What was amazing to me was that while I'm reading this book, I'm playing out my own life, watching UConn win championship after championship. I'm from Syracuse, so UConn was in the Big East with Syracuse those days, and watching her just kill it on the floor, totally not understanding that she's having this not opposite life, but parallel life of faith trying to redeem this person. And then not until I saw the ESPN documentary just a year ago and picked up that book that I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, the ability, and that's where I think this intersection of sports and faith, this ability for sports to activate athletes to be redeemers, I think is something perhaps, maybe you've seen this more than me, that athletes don't even know the power that they have and how they use that power. What's your thought on that?
They definitely have that. They definitely have that power because they have a lot of power in our society.
They have the power, but do you think they, as they go into that field, right? Do you think they understand the enabling power that they do have?
Not necessarily. And I think that, I don't think so necessarily. It's more of maybe just a personal journey, and but I think that they certainly can sense it in a lot of cases, just even large and small, when they see the changes that they can make in society. And I'm thinking, well, you're in LA, somebody like Clayton Kershaw and the work that he does there. I don't really know all that much about it, but I know Clayton is very involved in the community through his faith. He's evangelical Christian. It's always really interesting to me to see this stuff because I'm actually not particularly religious. I guess I'd describe myself as like a agnostic Christian, Buddhist, super interested in Judaism, super interested in Islam, friends from every faith. I mean, that I really respect faith, but I also am partly sort of repelled by aspects of it. But even though I'm some of it, I'm like, I don't know. I'm still, again, in that curiosity. I want to know, I want to be there. It was just awesome to be in a Christian evangelical church with Maya Moore and watch her singing. It's a place I would never be. People I don't fully understand or necessarily agree with entirely. I still want to connect with them. To be with rabbis and those, for instance, I think you might have read the stories I wrote about Rabbi Bierman in LA. Be with him, at his synagogue, and I think probably in terms of worldview, I'm much more aligned with somebody like him in his synagogue, but still as a total world that I don't know. Oh man, I just love every part of that. I just love.
And so the way that you just described yourself, actually, I see this image of a boxer sort of like going to the punch, but then also backing up and going and backing up. And so when you think about that in the sports world, what role of sports do you think this ideas of both faith and social activism should have? For instance, a couple of months ago, I interviewed Len Elmore, who teaches a class at Columbia University about athletes and activism. During the NBA bubble, we see Black Lives Matter on the court and on the jerseys, equality for everybody. We see different rainbow symbols happening in the sports world. And so at the other hand, my good friend Dan Schulman, ESPN, says, you know what? I'm just here to give America an escape of everything else and just play the game. And so where is that balance? Especially you wrote a beautiful piece and an important piece, the 1619 Project, about race in the NBA. Where are there moments that we have to sort of slide that in? Do they just come to us naturally? Or do we have to look for places to add it because we know millions of people are both watching and intrigued by sports?
Wow, that's a layered, difficult question. I think all of that, I'm trying to figure it out. I am naturally attracted to athlete activism, and I think it's something that and also just the natural connections between our games and broader society. It's just, it's just it touches on so many things that I deeply care about, and so many of my heroes were very involved, like people like Arthur, obviously Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, all those folks, Billie Jean King, Althea Gibson. I just admire all that, and yet I also appreciate the escape factor. So I don't know. I try to. I think if you're inclined that way, it's nice to keep your eyes open about it, and to I keep my eyes open for it when I see it in sports a bit. again, yeah. So some of writing, I think, is trying to figure yourself out. Like, so I'll write things and I realize, like, wait a second, that's because I don't really, I'm wrestling with all of this. And so, I had the idea for that, the sort of the sports as religion and sort of, I was at the Super Bowl and just felt like that was a big faith house. I was at a place of worship in a way. Just the whole experience. It just felt like this is the same sort of experience that you'd have in a ecstatic evangelical church, or when you're deeply spiritual, looking around at all the people and how immersed they were, and how important and the athletes are, and how the athletes were watching them transcend difficulty in what they're doing. Let me just it's a little loud outside. Do you mind if I'm just I'm gonna shut this window. Working from home, garbage truck outside. So you see Patrick Mahomes on one leg willing his team to victory. You see Sabonis in the NBA playoffs, hobbling and heat beaten and with the black eye, and Draymond stepping on his chest and coming back and then losing. And those are all elements that are in the New Testament, Old Testament, Torah, all of the major, the three faiths, and in Hinduism, but all of that stuff is covered in our faith texts and in the way that we see religion. So I don't know. That really hit me when I was at the Super Bowl, and then I thought of all the other things that had gone on in those several months before the Super Bowl. Damar Hamlin, it just felt like a kind of a spiritual moment. So,
well, it's interesting. I bring this sentence up to many of my guests, but there's a very famous Rabbi Solomon Schechter, one of the first great American rabbis, who told his graduating classes at the seminary that you can't be a rabbi in America without giving a sermon about baseball, because of not the importance of the game, but the significance of the game within the institution of this country of America as well. And the same could be said so much in so many different sports, as you just said. It's not that you're speaking about the game. It's, you said, redemption stories happen on every single level, whether it's arts, culture, music, sports, etc. So I want to bring one last topic in here, then ask one last question about journalism, because mental health has become such an important piece of sports, but also in the religion world, it's become a piece that we cannot ignore anymore. Here at Sinai Temple, we just opened up a Sinai Temple Mental Health Center, which is revolutionary in the religion world. And one of the pieces that you wrote about in 2018 was about Isaiah Woods, I believe formerly Isaiah Renfro. And it was just heart-wrenching reading that piece, understanding that he was a star on the field, but when he went home, he was a nobody, and not nobody to anybody, but nobody to himself. So how does this mental health aspect fit in terms of the world that we're thinking about, the people that you're talking about, depressed people, addicts, prison, but even the people from the outside, they look like everything. From the inside, there's complete brokenness.
Yeah. That's a subject that I'm really fascinated by, and I want to write even more than I have about more directly. It touches everything. I really applaud what you're doing at the temple. And again, it's two things. It's personal experience. My family has been racked by mental illnesses going back at least to one of my grandmothers, one of my brothers. I struggle sometimes with depression, which I know just lays me low. Luckily, it's not so bad that I can't function, but I know the feeling. I think people from the outside would think, oh, you've got everything going for you, and you work for the New York Times, you did all cool stuff as an athlete. Well, a lot of that has been a battle just being down and just feeling, all those feelings, right? So I really empathize. I really care about this subject, and as much as I can do to try to write about it. And my time with Isaiah was a really, I think that story had a lot of impact on people, and I'm glad you read it. I think we can't talk about this enough. It just affects so much of our society. Obviously, it affects sports. People, obviously in Los Angeles, and I'm based in Seattle, the homeless situation here, for instance, crime that we talk about, it's just so much of it is, I think, and the way our society is frayed, and people aren't connecting. People feel disconnected. Everybody's pissed off at each other. I just feel there's so much of a kind of undiagnosed mental illness or the mental health that we could all, I wish as a society that we would just confront that as a root cause of so many of our difficulties. So in sports, I'm always interested in trying to, when I can, I'm always looking for stories like that. And in my future job at the Times, I will not exclusively be writing about sports, and I will definitely be looking for stories that can hit on that issue. So it's a deeply, deeply, deeply personal issue to me.
Actually, my mentor, Rabbi David Wolpe, said that spirituality is done alone, religion is done together. And I think that sentence encompasses how you talked about the religion of the good and the religion of the bad. I actually think the religion of the good is when it is done together, because we know that a root cause of a lot of this mental illness is loneliness, and not just the social isolation of loneliness, but loneliness in a world that seems so busy and crowded. And so if religion can be a force that can bring people together, not to remove loneliness, but to give structure of loneliness, I think then we can get to actually what you just talked about, which is more redemption stories that can really uplift people's souls as well. And so one last question, just as you have mentioned over this interview, and it's always humbling and daunting interviewing an interviewer. So I appreciate your honesty and transparency.
You're very good.
Openness. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's I always did want to be a sports reporter. It just took me 2 decades of being a rabbi to get to that point. But journalism today, it's literally changes overnight. And you've obviously had a varied career from ESPN, LA Times, New York Times, but now you sit at this crux of another moment where basically, I read the New York Times sports section as a kid, and obviously I've gotten to know you recently, but to hear that the sports section of the New York Times is going to be disbanded is jaw-dropping. And so what does this mean for sports, and what does it mean for journalism as how we how we consume this topic?
Yeah, well, it's going to be disbanded, and they're the higher ups. The plan is for the Athletic, which the New York Times now owns. Is the plan is for them to basically supplant us in a way. So that in the end is a contraction of the industry, because there's, although most of us, we're all being offered jobs within the paper, we're not losing our jobs unless we want to walk away. And we'll be certainly paying attention to sports and trying to continue to write what we think of as distinctive sports stories. I think we're not going to be doing that exclusively. It's just there's less people it's less people writing about the subject. The Athletic has as far as I can see, has a sort of different stance about sports. It's more fan oriented. Maybe not as critical. I don't want to cast aspersions on it, but I've tried to look at sports with a very critical eye, and not just totally pleasing the fans, and actually challenging fans. As a columnist, in my role as a columnist.
Trevor Bauer letter is a great example.
Yeah. I've tried to challenge the system. Sometimes
the Justin Turner letter. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I wrote about Trevor Bauer too, and pretty challenging. I'm not sure how much of that will continue at the Athletic. I can't say. So it's just, again, it's just kind of the state of journalism writ large in America. Just continues to contract. It's not good for our society. I've always been I've been lucky to work mostly at big papers, but my biggest concern is in the loss of the local reporting, and the smaller and medium-sized papers. I think as we see that go away and see less accountability and less questions being asked of power, that's a very, very vital role. And I've always looked at my role too as, of course, there's the connecting and the curiosity and the empathy, but there's also challenging power. And that is a very important role to me. And as we have less of that in the press, it's just not a great thing for our society. And we're dealing with so many other things too in this whole sphere with misinformation and God, it's just it's a tough one. It's a very tough blow. It's been a very tough 2 days. I'm trying to smile through it, but even beyond 2 days, because we've known about this for a while. But also not entirely unexpected that it would happen. So hopefully, in the end, the paper will be successful and the readers will be served well. And it's one of those things. I don't have the control I'd like to have about it. So I just have to do, for me and all of my colleagues, just do our best.
Well, know that on behalf of Sinai Temple and Rabbi on the Sidelines, your journalism authenticity is crucial to how we not simply read these stories, but how we see the world, and your time that you have given us in these, I know, difficult moments for you, will, God willing, lead to a redemption story that will hopefully be participating on your journey as well. And so we want to thank Kurt Streeter from Sports of the Times column of the New York Times, ESPN, the magazine, LA Times. So a local boy coming back to LA, at least virtually, for an hour or so. And we look forward to learning with you and from you on this journey ahead. Kurt, thank you so much for spending time on Rabbi on the Sidelines today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a good day.